Hello everyone, Rabbi Yoni from Congregation Shaare Tzedek here. Thank you for watching Three Opinions. This is Season 2, Episode 2, when I sit down with University of Michigan Professor Victor Lieberman. We talk about a range of things from what's going on in Israel right now with the current government, to the conflict between Israel and Palestine, and to the academic climate on college campuses. We have a fascinating interview. So again, thank you for watching, and please enjoy Vic Lieberman.
So, first I just want to say thank you to you all for being here. It's good to be in person, and it's good to be able to have these conversations together. By one more asterisk I put at the beginning of this is that this is not an easy conversation, right? And none of these conversations are easy conversations because the name of this program comes from the old Jewish idiom that there are two Jews and three opinions, right? But in reality, it's more like there's two Jews and eight opinions, right? That no doubt I will contradict myself and argue against myself, and we'll agree and we'll disagree and we'll do everything in between. I'm sure
you know the story about the Jew who was shipwrecked on an island, and he built several synagogues, and someone comes to the rescue and he says, well, which is your synagogue? He says, oh, that's my synagogue. What about the other? I'd never go in there in a million years.
That's the synagogue I never step foot in, right? No, that's exactly right. And that's why this is so important. Right, I think especially some of the conversation that we're going to get into is not an easy conversation, and so often it becomes preachy, or one person speaking to someone else and saying what's right and what's wrong, as opposed to sitting down and saying where's the conversation, where can we find common ground, where do we go from here, right? As a way of building up and hopefully finding some means towards peace and a solution, rather than trying to convince someone of who's right, who's wrong, who's the bad guy, who's the good guy type things. So all of that is to say, I think this is going to be a really incredible conversation. I'm really thankful, Professor Lieberman, that you came to join us tonight.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. So this is what we usually don't do, but I'm going to give just a quick bio because it is it's important, and I think that it's important for us to introduce you by way of your impressive resume, but also to talk about who you are within the Jewish community here in Metro Detroit and some of your prominence there. So Professor Lieberman is a historian of early modern Southeast Asia and Eurasia. He presently serves as the first name is it the Raul?
Well, yeah.
Raul Wallenberg Distinguished University Professor of History and Professor of Asian and Comparative History at the University of Michigan, where he began teaching in 1984. That year, he published a seminal work, Burmese Administrative Cycles, Anarchy, and Conquest, which profoundly impacted scholarship on mainland Southeast Asia through an analysis of alternating governance patterns in 16th to 18th century Burma. You came out with a 2-volume study, Strange Parallels, Southeast Asia in Global Context, circa 800 to 1830. And that study argued that in terms of basic dynamics, chronology, and trajectory, patterns of political and culture integration in mainland Southeast Asia over several centuries resembled those in much of Europe and Japan, and to a lesser extent in China and South Asia. A lead featured review in the Principal Journal of History, the American Historical Review, claimed that Lieberman's 2-volume magnum opus is the most important work of history produced so far this century.
The century wasn't very old at that point.
The century wasn't very old, but still. I mean, that is that's an accolade for sure. 2 international conferences, both in London and Osaka, have been held to discuss Lieberman's scholarship, in each of the 2 chief journals of Asian Studies, Modern Asian Studies, and the Journal of Asian Studies, has devoted a special edition to his work. His books have won prizes from the Association of Asian Studies and World History Association. In 2014, Professor Lieberman won the Golden Apple Award, conferred by student ballot as the best teacher at the University of Michigan. Professor Lieberman obtained his Bachelor of Arts degree from Yale University in 1967. I've heard of it. Graduating first in his class with summa cum laude distinction. He obtained a PhD in Southeast Asian history from the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London in 1976. And all of this is to say that I'm intimidated, but also just incredibly excited. So again, welcome. We are so happy to have you here.
Thank you again.
So one of the things that I love about this program is that I get to ask just a bunch of personal questions too, and learn a little bit more about you. So I read this incredible and impressive CV and accolades of your incredible work, but I also just want to ask, to get us started, tell me a little bit about you. We were talking before this started. You grew up in Baltimore. My in-laws, also from Baltimore, who are here. So how did you grow up? What was life like growing up in Baltimore? What was Jewish life like in Baltimore? Just anything to kind of by way of introduction.
Well, thank you. Well, Northwest Baltimore, where I grew up, was a Jewish enclave, a Jewish ghetto, you might say. And I never really met or knew any non-Jews until I went to high school, and even then I stayed in classes that were primarily Jewish. So I had it was a very secure, warm, comforting environment in which to grow up. And I in retrospect, and at the time, I loved it. I felt very grateful, very at home. My parents were extremely supportive. All their friends, of course, were Jewish, and we were active in the Jewish community through personal commitment and through the fact that my uncle, my father's brother, was a very prominent Reform rabbi in Baltimore, and now my brother, who's also a Reform rabbi in Massachusetts. So there's a family connection for sure. My grandparents, my mother's family, were very active in Zionist causes. My grandmother helped provide the sheets and the linen for the Exodus 47 boat, which went to Palestine. And she was very active in Hadassah. And when I was growing up, there were Holocaust survivors at the house all the time. I remember my barber had his cut my hair. I saw his tattoo number. So it was a very Jewish environment. And when I got to college, of course, there weren't any Jews, but I didn't find the transition difficult. Also, I was somewhat surprised in retrospect. At the time, it didn't impress me, but I never encountered any anti-Semitism. In my whole life, I don't think I've never been the victim of any kind of anti-Semitic comments or discrimination. I guess it's somewhat surprising. But what I did find when I went to college was that it wasn't a Jewish environment anymore. I had to adjust. And so I, without self-consciously rejecting or abandoning my background, I marginalized it for a long time until I got married, and then when I was married, we tried to recreate the environment of my childhood. Yeah, is this the one?
Yeah, it should be on.
Okay. You want me to repeat what I just said?
You're good. That's better. Great.
Okay, sorry. So,
So you went into university setting, which was a transition because you grew up in this really Jewish enclave, and yet at the same time, you were saying that this was not a hard transition. It felt.
No, I was worried about. I'd been big fish longer, so my sense of achievement was less, and my sense of importance was considerably diminished. So I think to compensate for that anonymity, I became intensely involved with my studies. I became, I guess you'd say, obsessively interested in at the same time, I was intrinsically interested in history. So I worked all the time. I remember I used to dream about my GPA, my grade point average. So you might say I was an obsessive nerd in those days. And it stood me well, and that I've maintained those interests ever since then.
I was going to say that you're not a small fish in a big pond when you graduate summa cum laude from Yale, right? Like
Yeah.
that kind of perked you up pretty quick, right?
Yeah.
So my question, so you became really interested in history and dove into your studies.
Yeah.
What specifically got you interested in Asian history and Southeast Asian history?
Well, interest in history and in non-Western cultures began when my mother used to read Bible stories to me every night, and they were illustrated. And I remember being absolutely fascinated with the pictures. And I was like 6, 7 years old. I'd ask my mother, "What's this mean? Who's this person?" And so it kind of embedded itself in my consciousness, an interest in non-Western cultures and in the past. So that was the start of it. But then when I was in college, the Vietnam War was de rigueur. That was
Interesting.
And that's how I got interested in Southeast Asia.
Wow. Okay, because of the Vietnam War.
Yeah, and then I decided to go to graduate school in Southeast Asian Studies. Once you're in Southeast Asian Studies, you have to specialize in one country. So I chose Burma for a variety of reasons.
Okay, fascinating. Was part of the draw to Asian studies, was the geography or the proximity of Israel part of that? Were you interested at all in?
No, I wasn't at that point interested particularly in Jewish history. I mean, I knew something about it, but I think it was the exoticism, the otherness, the unfamiliarity of Asia that attracted me by way of implicit contrast with European and Western patterns that, of course, were more familiar to me. I like the idea of human possibilities, and you could recognize that range of possibilities more easily by studying a very different culture. So I think that's what attracted me.
So it's. I hope this doesn't come off as anything other than a compliment and an accolade, but you're very, very well known here in Metro Detroit and really in the academic world in general, but in
my family for sure. Yeah.
Definitely in your family, without a doubt, but also within kind of these different spheres and for different reasons, right? You're this incredible scholar of Southeast Asian history, and everyone who studies Southeastern Asian history knows who you are. And also in the Jewish community in Metro Detroit, we know you very well because of how prominent you are for your Israel advocacy. As one reason. I mean, there's multiple reasons. And I know that people in this room are lucky enough to have had children take classes with you, or maybe have taken classes themselves with you, and which makes sense with this Golden Apple Award because everyone raves about you as a teacher. But I think my first introduction to you was seeing some of your op-eds, not just through U of M, but through other colleges who have done some, fascinating decisions regarding Israel, or have said some outlandish things I never thought I would see in campuses regarding Israel, and your responses to them, but also standing, up at the lectern and speaking out against BDS, and really fighting and advocating for an honest examination of Israel. So I'm wondering, as your role in Ann Arbor goes, do you walk through each day kind of straddling both of those identities? And how does that work where you're really kind of in multiple worlds and really prominent in multiple worlds?
Well, I've been able to combine the two because, as you may or may not know, I teach a very large course on the Arab-Israeli conflict. So that's history, and it deals with the past, but it's also very Jewish, obviously. I guess maybe 40% of my students are Jewish, something like that. So, and I interact with them, and I find that rewarding. I like to provide them with new perspectives and kind of complicate the social media narratives with which they're inundated. But also I find it exciting because I like to make contact with non-Jewish students. And I've become quite friendly with a number of Muslim students. And they find it, I don't know exactly what they're thinking, but I think they find it strange and somehow rewarding that a Jewish scholar who's obviously very pro-Zionist would sympathize with their situation and be able to explain it with some sympathy. So I've become friendly, actually, one Arab-American student who was the founder of the chief anti-Israel organization on campus and who was the president of the Arab Student Association. He took my course. He thought it was pretty interesting. And he went on to do an honors honors program under my direction. And we've become very good personal friends. I see him on a social basis fairly often. So I find that dimension attractive and rewarding.
It's wonderful.
Without abandoning my commitment to Israel in any way.
Right. Have you seen a change in that class?
Yeah, I think the Jewish attendance, it's hard to know from names, but I think the Jewish attendance is less than it used to be.
Okay.
And the Muslim attendance is somewhat larger. And I think the general, it's hard to say, but I think the general sympathy for Israel is diminished compared to, say, 10 years ago. That's my impression, but it's hard to know. And also, when they come out of the class, many of them think quite differently than when they entered the class.
Yeah.
Which is my goal, really.
Yeah, great. And also, I guess I was asking that question in regards to demographics, but also in regards to civility. Has that changed at all? Or do you, for the most part, do you see that people are there willing to learn and willing to have, good thought-provoking conversations and being able to, change their mind and to come out, with some different thoughts and opinions.
Yeah, so those kind of intense interactions would be concentrated in the sections, which I don't teach.
Okay.
I just have a large lecture, and I have questions and answers. There's opportunity for people to talk, but there hasn't been any animosity or rancor in the public forum in the discussion there. When I started the course, I had to meet with the associate dean to decide what we would do if violence broke out in the classroom. But I never had any trouble, and I think it's because I go to great lengths to present both sides somewhat sympathetically, so nobody says my narrative has been neglected. Now, there are some Jewish students actually who like that. Some Jewish students who are involved with, if not now, when, you know what that is, it's a very anti-Zionist. So they came, they talked to me, they complained about X, Y, Z. They hadn't taken the course, but they had heard things. So I said, why don't you take the course? But they were afraid to take the course. They were afraid that my mind's made up, don't confuse me with the facts.
Right.
And I guess there are Muslim students too who feel the same way. I don't want to hear any more Zionist propaganda, but I haven't met them, so I can't speak to their feelings.
I think for a lot of us, that's kind of the image we get of college campuses nowadays.
Yeah.
Is I have some really strong opinions about your course. I haven't taken your course, but I have some very strong opinions about it, because that reflects a lot of what we have in society. Is I'm a self-proclaimed expert on something that I know nothing about, and I will tell you that I haven't read the book or seen the movie, but I'm really passionate about it, right? So it's actually it's reassuring to hear that there are students who are in your class and learning and having this dialogue and having these really thoughtful conversations, and not only that, but they're emerging from it with different opinions, and that you're maintaining relationships with some of these folks.
It's hard to know because I don't speak. There's hundreds of students, but I think that's true of many. I get course evaluations. Some actually have some criticism from I think Muslim students. It's pretty obvious from they think I'm not sympathetic enough. I had some criticism from Orthodox Jewish students who said that I don't treat the Haredim with sufficient respect, and that may be a legitimate legitimate point, but. So I'm open to criticism. I'm going to modify my lectures to address those particular issues, but I can't go overboard in terms of sympathy for the Arab position because I do present it sympathetically, but it seems to me that the historical reality is such that the case for injustice is less persuasive than the case for poor decisions.
Okay, so let's get into the meat and potatoes, right? So one of the especially this topic of Israel and Palestine, outside of classrooms. I was not in the classroom when I was at Columbia and Barnard, but I worked at the Hillel there. So my interaction with my students there was the apartheid wall and different things on campus where people were interacting outside of the classroom, and it was not at all about conversation. No one was talking about, let me hear your story. I want to learn about you. It was, this is what's happening. This is what's right. This is what's wrong. You're the oppressor. I'm the victim. Or you're the victim and I'm the oppressor. Whatever it might be, but really heels dug in. And so I'm wondering how, going back to social media and going to these ideas of learning so many things, are being inundated with all this information about who's right and who's wrong. What are some of the things that people are just dramatically wrong about?
Okay, well, let me preface this by saying that when I was in college, I was a fanatic anti-war activist. And I didn't really know what I was talking about, but I was extremely enthusiastic and passionate and self-righteous. So I sympathize with the kind of idiotic kids that I have to deal with on a regular basis.
I was too scared to even ask you that question about, you said you got involved with the Vietnam War, and somebody was like, well, which side were you on? And I just stayed away from it.
That goes to the territory. When you want to separate from your parents, you want to show who you are, you want to think well of yourself, so you have to stand out. So I think that, I tend to give them some slack on that regard. But the basic problem is, I think that the Israeli-Arab conflict is assimilated to the narrative of African Americans in the United States. And the analogy is very poor. I mean, there are some analogies. Palestinians were a non-Western people who couldn't compete technologically and economically with the Western-oriented, Western-trained Jews. Of course, African Americans have had historic disadvantage competing with white population, and that's produced feelings of self-hatred, self-inferiority, and produced prejudice on the part of the dominant population. So those are similarities, and in both cases, African Americans, or you might say American Indians, they're minding their own business, and suddenly from outer space came this dominant civilization with which they couldn't compete. And that's true of the Palestinians. So there are these similarities, but that's as far as it goes, as far as anti-Israel critics are concerned. They simply look at the image of victimization and fail to acknowledge several things. First of all, I think most basically, although Palestinians were the victims of unwanted, essentially alien invasion of their land, although obviously the Jews go back, but that didn't mean anything to them because that was thousands of years ago. As far as they're concerned, the Jews are alien, unwanted interlopers. That said, the response to the Jewish challenge has been consistently self-defeating, emotionally indulgent, myopic, short-sighted, and counterproductive. Because the problem is, first of all, underlying emotional feelings of injustice and deprivation, which you can sympathize with. But in addition to that, there's never a Palestinian nation. There's never a Palestinian political organization. There's never a Palestinian political identity. So the movement is highly fragmented. There's never been a central leadership, which means that it devolves into competing factions. And in this competition for popular support, the most violent radical faction always wins out. There's a whole history of that. We can go through this. Happened 6 or 7 times. It's happening now with the rise of Hamas at the expense of the PA. So because the most violent radical faction wins out, they are most opposed to compromise. So every time a peace agreement is on the table, some sort of compromise, which would be in their interest, it's rejected, which leads to it, and it's rejected with violence against Israel, or against the Jews. The Jews act in essentially self-defensive manner, which diminishes Palestinian prospects as time goes on. They have less territory, less authority, which increases the sense of bitterness and anger, which leads to further self-defeating rejection of compromise. So their position, like 6 or 7 opportunities, they've all been rejected. They've all, and this feeds the sense of helplessness and self-pity. But at the same time, it precludes any kind of rational analysis of what would have been a better strategy. What could we have done differently? What would have been more productive? And it's always self-pity and victimization and anger at the outside without any introspection. And that seems to me the fundamental problem. Now, I hasten to say, this is not a trait unique to Palestinians. I'm afraid that Israel is showing the same inclination now with the far right. It's self-indulgent, myopic, uneducated, unfamiliar with the wider world, completely culturally encapsulated, and without any long strategic vision, without any understanding where they're going to go. How could the settlements not lead, indefinite settlement, how could it not lead to an apartheid system? And how could that ever be sustained by the rest of it? There's absolutely no thought to it. It's just emotionally self-indulgent expansion and reaction to what they see as Palestinian provocations. So that's the horrible mistake the Palestinians have made. They've been essentially self-destructive. And I hope it doesn't happen. We can't, but I'm afraid there's a tendency on the far right in Israel to go in the same direction.
Interesting.
And that's very upsetting.
I have a cynical take that a lot of the sympathy that comes from big names of support for the Palestinian cause comes from a lot of identity of self-victimization as well, right? So you used the metaphor of the African American community in the United States, and another huge supporter of Palestine is the country of Ireland, right? Who also see, I think, in a lot of ways, this happened to us.
Yeah, it's anti-British sentiment.
It's an anti-British sentiment that is used, and so if you go to let's see an Irish soccer game or something, you'll see a lot of Palestinian flags being flown, and there's this strong sense of solidarity. But I'm wondering if all of these different narratives are coming together and saying we've been there, we understand what that's like, and yet at the same time, there's not any real support that takes place in that regard, other than saying we know what it's like, right?
Yeah.
It makes me feel really that it's just a further injustice upon Palestinians that here are people saying, we get it, we know your cause, we're not going to touch this, other than saying publicly that we know what it's like, but not actually jockeying for any kind of position of saying, let's get to a place where we can make some peace, let's get to a place where we can prop you up on an international platform that's respected and not run by Hamas, or not run by, narrated by violence, or whatever it might be.
Well, Ireland consistently votes in international forums against Israel.
Right.
It's very hostile to Israel. As you may know, the Northern Irish Protestants fly Israeli flags.
Right.
So you have this polarization, but all these flag demonstrations are simply a matter of self-identification. It really doesn't have much to do with the intended beneficiary of their sympathy.
But isn't that further demeaning to say, I mean, your cause isn't really, I mean, we're using your cause as just kind of our own understanding of ourselves.
But everybody sees the world that way. Everybody sees external events in terms of internal requirements. I mean, the sympathy for the Palestinians is primarily from the Muslim world, which is obviously identification. It's also from many non-Muslim third world countries who see the conflict in terms through the lens of colonialism.
Right.
The West was nasty to us. Israel is identified as the West, so we're going to support the victims of Israeli policy. So again, it's kind of self-referential, myopic perspective.
Is there credibility to that argument of Israel being kind of the last bastion or the last push of colonialism?
Well, there are analogies between Israel and colonialism. I mean, it was a Western project. It was intrusive into an area where it wasn't really wanted. It benefited because it had technological and economic superiority, military superiority. It benefited from Western support. So in all those ways, it was analogous to colonialism. But the fundamental difference is that there was no metropolitan country from which Israel was an outgrowth. Colonialism sent people overseas from the home country, from the metropolitan country, on behalf of the home country, and that relation was fundamental. I mean, the Pilgrims, the American settlers all came from England. There wasn't any home country for England, for Israel, for Zionism. Zionism had some colonial attributes, but Zionism was essentially a nationalist movement. It was an attempt by the Jews to provide themselves with refuge against the horrible onslaught of anti-Semitism in Europe. I don't have to tell you about that. And it was an attempt to imitate the Italian and the German and the French unifications of their country, in the sense that we can do the same. We can achieve a sense of security by becoming a recognized nation. So although it has colonial features, it's much easier to identify Israel in terms of a nationalist trajectory, in terms of nationalist achievements and nationalist self-image. That seems to me the most, it's not all one or the other, but that seems to me the most appropriate lens with which to see the conflict. So
I'm wondering too if part of the rejection from Palestinians when these mass waves of Jewish immigration were happening was also a little bit of, kind of a changing of the guard in some ways, right? Where the Ottoman Empire is fading and the Caliphate is gone and the dream of like this big Muslim empire is fizzling out and is no more. And yet here's this constantly oppressed tiny people who are now making moves that were kind of unheard of.
Are you talking about the Jews?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so the reaction was surprise and shock, especially since these people were always considered inferior.
Right.
Why should Jews, who were dhimmis,
right.
they were marginal. In the pre-modern world, there's no such thing as equality.
Right.
This is a marginal community. Why should they lord it over good Muslims? It was unacceptable. In the same way as in the American South, why should blacks suddenly have privileges that make them in a position superior to whites?
Right.
So it's the same kind of instinctive rejection of change.
Was there any difference of perspective from the Arab Muslim population there about Jews who had always been there, as opposed to, the perceived white European Jews who were coming?
The indigenous Jewish population tried to straddle both. In culture, they were Arabized. They tried to straddle both sides, and to avoid identification with either. But it became impossible, especially once violence broke out in 36, 39. They had to identify the Jewish European population.
Gotcha. Okay. So we talked about some of the myths, right? Some of the things that people get wrong when we're having this conversation. What are some of the things that people get right?
Okay. Well, let me just say one of the other things that people get wrong is that Israel has always acted basically in terms of self-defense. Everything that Palestinians complain about, the annexation of the West Bank, settlements, the security barrier, the Gaza blockade, security controls, everything is a reaction to Palestinian violence. So it's all kind of self-created prison in which they live. And that's not understood. Israel is seen as a gratuitously aggressive. The background, the provocation, the context of Israeli self-defense is never understood, is never examined. It's always a matter of look at this misery, look at this imposition. And that's the first glaring distortion. The second horrible distortion is the fact that Israel's treatment of Palestinians internally and externally is infinitely more sensitive and restrained and respectful than the treatment of ethnic or religious minorities almost any place else in the Middle East or Africa or Asia. There's the best index of democracy in the world today is the so-called Economist Index of Democracy put out by it's a think tank in Britain. It's a neutral and independent organization. They rank countries. Number one is the most democratic and the best treatment of minorities. Number 167 is the worst. Number one is Norway, 167 is North Korea.
Okay.
Israel is number 29. The United States is 25, and France is number 30.
Okay.
So every Mideastern country is 100 or less, or worse. So this is not appreciated. Israel is, by all standards, an extraordinarily tolerant, inclusive society. Arab Israelis are second-class citizens. There's no doubt about that. But at the same time, they have rights which are completely unknown anyplace else for minorities, anyplace else in Asia or Africa. And their position is incomparably better than that of people in South Africa. The analogy with South Africa is absurd. There's absolutely no similarity ever between the blacks and the wrong analogies to apartheid South Africa. The best analogy in the world today is the treatment of women in Muslim countries, where you have half the population are born as genetic inferiors, destined at birth to be ruled by the better, genetically superior half of the population. That's an apartheid situation. But that's never acknowledged. The UN Human Rights Council has no interest in that whatever. So these are fundamental misperceptions, which I'm eager to point out.
Yeah.
But I diverted myself from your question. What question was not what did they get wrong, what did they get right?
So before we get to, because now I gotta just ask the elephant in the room question: why? What's different about Israel?
Well, why is Israel more tolerant and more inclusive?
Well, that, but what I was thinking more is, why is Israel singled out when all of these, you just gave me a great list of all these examples of how Israel is far more tolerant than all of these other places, including Western countries.
Why is Israel singled out? Because 30% of the population of the UN are Muslim countries. It's automatic. Another 25-30% are ex-colonial countries who see it through a colonial lens. And I think those are the two main constituents for anti-Israel sentiment.
You think there's some kind of form of guilt of these countries kind of doing atonement for their own colonial past?
You mean on the part of Western Europe?
Yeah.
Insofar as Ireland, insofar as Western Europe is hot. But the thing is that Western Europe is increasingly sympathetic to Israel. And of course, Eastern Europe is quite sympathetic to Israel. Europe is not enthusiastic about Israel, but you don't have the kind of anti-Israel instinctive reaction that you have in the third world. And then as China rises and as Russia does its best to recover self-respect and great power status, they jump on the bandwagon of anti-Westernism and use Israel as a metaphor for their overarching ambition.
Right.
They don't really care about the Middle East per se. They don't care about Israel. But it's
Cold War continues in the Middle
East. It's
East.
a matter of self-referential promotion.
Right.
Yeah, so I think these are some of the chief dynamics.
Okay. So what do people get right when they're trying to have a conversation about Israel and Palestine?
Well, actually, I'm optimistic about the way the world's going. I mean, after all, everything I've said, it may seem funny, but I'm quite optimistic because if Netanyahu can curb his crazy ultra-right wing, Ben-Gvir, and these people are beyond the pale. If he can curb them and stop the vigilantism on the West Bank, he is determined to have rapprochement with Saudi Arabia, which would bring over much of the Muslim world. That would basically end the conflict. except with Iran. That's a different story, but that would end the Arab-Israeli conflict. And Europe is supportive of that. The United States is supportive of that. Most people who are knowledgeable recognize that there's no Palestinian partner to deal with. You have to follow the strategy that Netanyahu came up with, which peace from the outside in rather than peace from the inside out. Make peace with the Arab world, and then the Palestinians will be brought along kicking and screaming at the end of the day. You can't make peace with the Palestinians and then through that make peace with the outer world, because the Palestinians are never going to agree to anything. So that's the strategy, and I think it's they say that, right, realistically or not, that there will be a peace agreement by the end of 2023, before the presidential election campaign starts in 2024. I don't know if it's going to happen, but it's feasible, it's possible. And if that happens, that would be a transformative, utter transformation.
Is that possible with the way that things are going in Israel? Or is that...
Well, that's the problem. And Netanyahu has to, I don't know, he has little room to maneuver. He can't move to the center because nobody wants to be his ally. So he has to hold on to the crazies. And it's hard to know how well he can tame them, to what degree he can calm them down.
I feel like history, you're the historian here, but I feel like throughout history, the idea of trying to calm down the crazies has been kind of a fool's errand in some regards.
It's the settler population which feels very insecure because they're surrounded by a hostile majority. And it's always the people who feel vulnerable. They're always most outwardly aggressive and internally cohesive. The two out-group hatred and in-group love go together, and that's how they are. And that was true. Say the settler population in Rhodesia was actually much more right-wing than the South African population. And the South African population was more right-wing than the English population. So this is a continuation of that. And the Pied Noir, the French colonists in Algeria were also much more right-wing than their French counterparts. So this is a continuation of that pattern. But the demographic strength of the settlers is limited, and the support for them anywhere outside Israel is non-existent.
Right.
So I would think that in the long term, the prospects for peace are reasonably good, but I'm always wrong. I wouldn't say it's going to happen, but I see a possibility, and that possibility, if it's realized, would be transformative.
Okay.
And that's Netanyahu's vision. I'm not a great fan of Netanyahu, but I think he's a very far-sighted individual.
Okay. And you think that that's one of the things that's lacking within this group of these right-wing approaches, is that it's so short-sighted? And
yeah, I mean, as I said before, how can the continuation of settlements indefinitely ever produce a stable situation? It's going to lead to an apartheid system. It's going to lead to Palestinian resistance. It's going to lead to alienation of the non-committed world population. It seems to be, there's no prospect for success, and this is not well thought out. This is a kind of instinctive emotional gratification, instantaneous self-indulgence. It's very, I don't know, maybe I'm being insufficiently charitable, but that's how it seems to me.
It seems to me that, Israel has made incredible strides since its existence as far as building and showing itself to be a leader in the democratic world, and advocating for those values, right? But if there's one place, and I feel like it's winning in that regard, and if there's one place that Israel's losing and continues to lose, I feel all the time, it's in the PR war, right? And these latest elections and the latest things, I feel like have done really terrible damage to that PR war.
Yeah, I agree. I think Israel's going through a transition. Somebody said that for the first 70 years of the Yishuv and Israel, from 1920 to 1990, something like that, you had the first Israel, which was dominated by Western, educated, liberal people of European origin. But demographically, of course, they're in retreat, because you're now entering, or you've already entered into the phase of the second Israel, which is dominated by Mizrahim and by Haredim, and also by European devotees of Vladimir Jabotinsky. The leadership of Likud is not Mizrahi, it's not Haredi, it's all Jabotinsky descended people. He was the far right. So this is the new Israel, and they don't have instinctive sympathy through education. They don't have any instinctive sympathy for the Western values that and that, of course, has, as you suggested, very poor potential implications for world opinion.
But isn't that also just here's where I'm going to contradict myself, and the 3 opinions or the 4 opinions or the 5 opinions come out? isn't that also just profoundly Jewish? That there's this idea of straddling the western and eastern parts of who we are, and not being the perfect Western democratic state that we're supposed to be, because Jews are also not just purely Western, and there's an idea of our diversity being, well, even if it's not the beautiful rosy picture that the West wants to see, Mizrahi Jews are also real and represent something. The Jabotinsky thing kind of throws a little wrench in that, because that's an ideology as opposed to an ethnicity, right?
Yeah.
But isn't that also part of who Israel is kind of a population that's Western and democratic, but also African and Mizrahi and Arab?
Yeah. Well, that kind of ethnic juxtaposition is unique to Israel. I don't see any important precedents in Jewish history. But within the Western European Jewish community, of course, you had splits between different segments of religious and secular Jews, and that became extremely intense in the 20th century. So, there's never been unity. It's always been a matter of factionalism.
But do you think there's I guess what I'm asking is, do you think there's a little bit of a rebellion that comes from Israel now that says, we're not just going to be the polite democratic Western country because you just want us to be?
Well, this is said by Mizrahim, Eastern Jews, and of course it's said by Haredim, who feel they've been victimized by the liberal establishment.
Right.
That they've been disrespected, marginalized, that their cultural values have been demeaned and a source of amusement and contempt and condescension. So there's a deep resentment on the part of many, not all, but many. And as far as Mizrahim are concerned, they never had any exposure to Reform or conservative Judaism. The only Judaism they know is the Orthodox. So they say, we're Jewish, we have to uphold Jewish values. This is the only Judaism we know, so we have to support the Haredim.
Right.
So there's this kind of inbuilt majority in favor of Haredim. Even though in economic terms, the Haredim are a tremendous drain on all working people, as you know.
Right.
And that's mainly Mizrahim, but it's a matter of cultural identification rather than economic dollars and cents.
Right. So that part I think is important, right? Is that cultural identity, right? Where we have, the Israel of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, which were very much, some of the great musicians that we think of, right? From David Broza and Meir Ariel and other folks who are very Western music, and for all intents and purposes, and yet now we see this big explosion of Mizrahi culture coming from Israel, and really owned and loved, really embraced, right? That's a very, very Arab-sounding music, and the culture becoming, I feel like, in some ways more Mizrahi. The Mizrahi population grows, and there's the sense of, Tel Aviv, Yallah Habibi, welcome to the Middle East, right? And that's like embracing this Middle Eastern culture and saying, we're not Europe, we're not Germany, we're not France, we're not Italy, we're the Middle East, and I'm wondering how much of that culture plays a part of that.
Well, the question is, how can that culture be reconciled with peace with the Palestinians?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think Palestinians also see it as, from my own personal experience, is kind of a further twist of the knife of saying, now you're taking our culture, right?
Yeah. But, some people used to think that the Mizrahi presence and power they'd become a bridge to peace with the Arab world, but that's not true. The Mizrahim are not the most, but they're generally quite unsympathetic and suspicious of Arabs. Their families were kicked out of Arab countries.
Right.
And they say, we know Arab culture better. You can't trust them. And they never tell the truth. So this is a kind of deep-seated prejudice which doesn't augur well.
Right.
And that's one of the reasons that the policy now is shifting away from what Netanyahu, as I say, I think is very far-sighted. He recognizes you have to have reconciliation. And in order to do that, you have to calm down the passions within the West Bank. But whether he can do it or not, I don't know.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. So I want to talk about that sense of binary, right? The binary of, especially in Israel, of religious and not religious, which is very real, right? You're either dati or you're chiloni. You're religious or you're secular. To a point, to such a point that when I was in rabbinical school in Israel, as a conservative rabbi, they say, you're chiloni? you're a secular Jew. Yeah, you can call yourself whatever you want. You can be a rabbi, a conservative rabbi, reforming rabbi, whatever. They're all the same. You're chilonim.
Yeah,
Right.
And the reform and the conservative rabbis are clowns.
Right, exactly. And they're not paid by the government. The government pays Orthodox rabbis. I also saw a statistic. I don't know if this is true, but I saw a statistic that there are more Jews for Jesus in Israel than there are conservative Jews, which I guess I could also believe. But the fact is, it's the thinking there is just so, in so many ways, even though it's such a complex society, this is black and this is white. This is where things are and this is where things aren't, right? And how we break free from that binary thinking. And then I'm going to transition us back to Ann Arbor, right, where we're talking about this really complicated subject in the Middle East, but then also bringing it back to how we're all complicated and talking with one another back home, and how some of our thinking goes from understanding the gray and the vast complexity of human existence and falling into these easily categorized ideas of black and white. So let's start in Israel and say, how do we break from the binary and get to a point of saying it's not right wing and left wing, it's not dati and chiloni, it's not peaceniks and extremists, it's finding where the gray is, if we can start there.
Well, that's what everybody says is the ideal, but nobody wants. I was going to say nobody wants to compromise, but that's not true. There are encouraging signs. I mean, Netanyahu has pulled the most extreme elements of his judicial reform. He's not going to pursue them. And he hasn't reached a formal agreement with the opposition, but he's going to take some of the enthusiasm away from the opposition. I think once they see that their goals are being to some extent listened to. I imagine there was justification for the criticism of the previous judiciary, which was not responsive to popular opinion and which made a number of rulings which seemed on the face of them quite outrageous. So some sort of compromise, that seems to be the direction in which things are going. Whether people will calm down on both sides, I don't know. But I'm not, what I'm saying is I'm not totally pessimistic. I'm not even pessimistic, to be honest.
Yeah. Well, I'm hearing that, which is thrilling, because I think that most people, when they see the current state of Israel, as someone who's lived in Israel, has citizenship in Israel, it's been a huge part of my life for 15 years plus.
You have citizenship still?
I do.
Uh-huh.
I don't vote because I don't feel like I'm allowed to, because I haven't lived there in a long time. But feeling probably the most cynical I've ever felt.
The most what?
Cynical.
Oh, okay.
And seeing some things in the state where I never thought I would see. And yet, at the same time, when I'm in Israel, when I was there last summer with teenagers from the local community, it's what it's always been to me, which is, the sababa yeye beseder, everything's going to be fine and everything's good and everyone's chill and relax, and that love and that passion is still there. So that makes me hopeful. But then I come back home and I read the papers and I read Ynet and I read everything, and then it's hard not to be despaired.
Well, all the tensions on the West Bank, it's all settler-related, settler-induced. That has to be brought under control. Once that's under control, there aren't any other outstanding issues. Gaza is relatively marginal and quiescent. Iran is a major problem, obviously.
Right. So just in the couple minutes we have left, let's talk about campus. And I think that one of the things that we see here back home is this constant idea of we just don't talk to one another, and we don't listen to one another, and we're so siloed, and we have our firm beliefs, again, experts in these things that we might not be anywhere close to experts on, and yet everyone feels to be experts. And I think that, for me, one of the great ironies of all of this is that in a world that is more and more understanding of the nuance and the non-binary nature of life, especially for young people, where we're talking about who see the fluidity of gender and sexuality and race and ethnicity and identity, when it comes to questions of morality and justice, it's right or wrong in so many different ways, and it takes 1 second to make up your mind?
Well, the two seem contradictory, but in fact they're part of the same process, because the enthusiasm for sexual ambiguity and for racial integration is based upon the feeling that marginal people can't be oppressed any longer. Their rights have to be recognized. And the moral outrage comes from the same emotional wellspring. It's a sense of immediate identification and support for people who are seen to be marginalized and unable to defend themselves. So the two outlooks might seem in contradiction, but they're actually complementary.
So what do you see on campus? Do you see a continuation of the idea of what the university was supposed to be, right? Which is this idea of teaching students who have been taught to regurgitate information. At least that's how I grew up, right? In public school is, here's the thing you memorize, and then if you memorized it correctly, then you get A's, right? And then go to college, and that's when you learn how to think for yourself. And it's more about this ideas of critical ideas and saying, don't worry about what you memorized, read, understand, wrestle with it, and then let's talk about it.
I don't know if that goes on. I don't know if it goes on any place. I don't think it goes on at the University of Michigan too much.
Yeah.
I think most of the courses, well, you have to distinguish, of course, between sciences and humanities. Sciences, but humanities, I think there's a dominant left-wing narrative that kind of marginalizes any alternative. And there's a kind of self-censorship. You really can't. You can't oppose this political correctness. You can't oppose the assumption that the marginal people are inherently moral and virtuous. You can't oppose the idea that people who have power and privilege are not inherently morally suspect. And these ideas are so deeply rooted. I don't see any. I don't see any diversity among faculty. I look at the history faculty. I don't know people's political affiliations, but I do know that at national polls of history professors, for every university campus, for every registered Republican, there are 33 registered Democrats. And I'm a registered Democrat by myself, by the way. I'm synthetic, but I believe in diversity and I believe in dialogue, and it's not really possible at the University of Michigan in many contexts. Maybe some places is. I can't generalize about everybody, obviously. Probably exceptions, but in my experience, especially in the history department, there's very little diversity of opinion.
Do you think that has any possibility of changing in the near future? I feel like that's changed dramatically since I've been in school, where I feel like when we would roll up our sleeves and really have it out with one another, and then we'd take the commuter train home and we would talk about, baseball or anything else. But now it's so personal and so deeply ingrained that I guess part of this is the naivety of thinking that a university setting is in some ways also kind of a lab and an experiment, right? That you're supposed to be able to go and you express ideas and learn and you're kind of safe in this bubble of being able to express yourself in your own ways, and that doesn't really exist anymore. Anything you say is public and out there, but
students can't develop diverse opinions because they only have one opinion in the classroom.
Right.
There's no diversity of teaching. There are no models with whom they could identify who would provide alternate views. It's a highly conformist environment. But again, this is not entirely that's how it was during the Vietnam War.
Right.
The faculty, the students, of which I was the chief exponent, were extraordinarily self-righteous and narrow-minded, and that's just a function of youth, and it's a function of also the fact, you see, academics think of themselves as really smart, clever people who should be running the world, but they don't have any power, and they don't have any money, and so they feel, well, I should be in charge, but nobody pays any attention to me, so their anger is proportionate to that sense of inadequate treatment.
So I have 6 more hours of questions for you, but I want to hand it over to our audience quick. But I do want to, just before we conclude, I know you are working on something. You have a forthcoming book titled "Embracing the World, Hating Your Neighbors: Ethnicity and Loyalty in Asia and Europe, the years 1200 to 1850." So I just want you to be able to give a quick little pitch. 1200 to 1850 is a small little scope, right? But to be able to talk a little bit about what you're working on.
I wrote something down because I knew you'd ask that. So I'm writing this book called "Hating the World." I'm saying, "Hating the World, Embracing Your Neighbors." And I'm trying to develop a new typology for pre-modern political organization across Europe and Asia. And I divide that vast region into three categories. Universal empires that didn't have what I call political ethnicity. There wasn't any central recognized ethnicity because they were multi-ethnic states. That's the first category. Then you have states that have political ethnicity. There's a recognized dominant ethnic core, but there's no modern nationalism. I'll define that if you're interested. And then you have ethnic states which become modern nationalism, and that's characteristic only of Northwestern Europe. So I'm trying to identify those three categories and explain why it is only in Northwestern Europe that core ethnic states evolved into nation states, the modern world. Nation states are the basis of all political organization today. But what's happened essentially, to simplify a complex issue, is you have the development of a peculiar culture in Northwestern Europe which believes in progress, secularism, dominance of economics, science, rationality, popular sovereignty, democracy. This is a whole cultural complex. It never existed anyplace else in the world. Now it's spreading throughout the world. Now it has spread throughout the world. Not the idea of not the idea of democracy and inclusion, but the idea of economic progress, state power, rationality, secularism, progressive view of history. There were always world religions, Confucianism, Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, but they all claimed to be world religions, but none of them was ever a world religion. They only controlled parts of the world. But now you have what I call the sixth world religion, which is Northwest European civilization, and that's become a world civilization. There's no challenge. Nobody can overcome the assumptions of Northwestern civilization. You can modify them in the same way as earlier religions were modified as they spread. Iran calls itself a democratic republic. It has elections and all. Of course, it's very different in the same way as Christianity in Guatemala was entirely different than Christianity in Italy. But the same nominal allegiance controls everybody who in the modern world. It's a kind of reduction of possibilities. So that's what I'm interested in.
Wow, that's fascinating. Thank you. We'll have you back after that's published. Okay. All right. So I want to open it up to our audience, but I also just want to say to officially end this part of our conversation, say thank you to Professor Lieberman for being here. It's really wonderful to have you. Thank you.
Thank you for
All
inviting
right.
me.
Yes, please.
Oh, so you're touching on the kind of like anti-Western, like anti-colonialist movement, and I kind of think that was an opportunity that Israel missed from the beginning.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Yeah, you were talking about how like the Palestinians got the sympathy of like a lot of the anti-colonialists and the anti. From its beginning, like I really think, just from reading about Israel's history, like I really think Israel missed an opportunity. Instead of jumping on the pro-Western bandwagon, it should have joined the non-aligned third world, and said, hey, we're with you. And I kind of think that we missed an opportunity, and we allowed the Palestinians to frame that narrative. And because remember how the Palestinians were siding with the Nazis first, but then that was a bad PR move. And so I kind of think that, I don't know if it's too late, but I kind of think that, if we want to maybe it's time to rethink, okay, how Western do we want to be?
Well, that's a very good point. Israel did question with which camp it wanted to be aligned up to about 1952. Up from 1947, earlier until 1950, Jews were primarily aligned with the Soviet Union. They were pro-communist. And they had to choose when the Cold War broke out, we were side with the Soviet Union or with the United States and the West. They sided with the West because the West is much more powerful, much more wealthy, because the Jewish community in the West was more, it wasn't under government control. So in the long term, so that identification with the West rather than the Soviet Union ultimately precluded the identification with the Third World, because the Soviet Union became the champion of the Third World. And once you identify with the West, things were perceived, then you were intrinsically less sympathetic to Africa and Asia.
Professor, I want to talk about numbers. You're an optimist about Israel, but don't the Haredim and the Orthodox Jews keep populating and propagating to the point where they're going to be the majority of the population and therefore will control basically their way of life within that state?
Yeah, I agree. That's the major problem facing Israel is the uncontrolled, not the uncontrolled, but the exceedingly rapid growth of the Haredi population. That's what's putting Netanyahu into power. The average Haredi woman has 6.6 kids. The average secular woman has about 3 kids. And within, by 2030, they're now 13% of the population. By 2030, they're going to be 17% of the population. And by 2040, I can't remember the figures, but they are going to be a majority of it. So that's a serious problem. But it's not really intrinsic to Haredi culture. It's a result of the political decisions that were made from 1977 when Likud came to power to create a welfare state which would support Haredi indolence, Haredi immersion in their own world, their own culture, which would encourage Haredi isolation. Until 1977, the average Haredi woman had 3 children, not 6.6, but 3 children, because there wasn't an elaborate network to support them. And 80% of Haredi men worked. Now it's less than half work. So this was the creation of a political structure. If that political structure was erected, it could also be disassembled. Where are you going to get the political will to do that? I don't know. I mean, but I think there's some awareness on the part. I mean, Israelis are smart people. They see the long-term danger. Actually, a bill was just passed in the Knesset, which is designed to increase workforce participation by Haredim and by Arabs. I don't know how far it's going to go, but Israelis will see that. I think they have to come to terms with that reality. And so I guess I come across as an incurable optimist, but I think that in the long term it'll be brought under control. But you know, I could be wrong. I'm always wrong. Steve.
You mentioned a political agreement by the end of 2023. What specifically thinking when you said that?
I'm sorry.
I think, unless I heard you wrong, you mentioned some type of political agreement within Israel. Did I hear you?
The goal, as stated actually by Anthony Blinken, is to get a peace deal with Saudi Arabia by the end of 2023. And that's a high priority for the Biden. They started very late. They didn't want to pick up the ball after Trump was gone because they didn't want to be associated with Trump's Abraham Accords. But that was actually the wisest, most dramatic change of Middle Eastern politics. If they started earlier, they probably could have had it by now. But no.
You think that'll happen?
I don't know. If they can't calm the West Bank down, it's not going to happen.
Is there a path forward to make peace with the Palestinians?
No, I think as Netanyahu said, you have to have peace from the outside in.
Peace from the outside in.
You can't go from the inside out.
Well,
so the Palestinians will have to be marginalized.
Israel
have to have a state, a kind of Bantustan state.
I'm going to give the microphone up, but Israel has trouble reconciling with Palestinians when you stop to think that the Arabs will outnumber the Israelis if you want to be a democracy. So it almost begs the question of a two-state solution, doesn't it?
You can't have a one-state solution. Would never work.
Can't.
It'd be an absolute disaster. Actually, the birth rates are now within Israel. The birth rates are now favoring Jews because the Haredim are so prolific. Our Jewish birth rate is higher than the Arab birth rate now.
Thank God.
Within Israel itself, if you include the West Bank, it's not. But one thing I'm sure is a one-state solution would be suicidal.
Yeah, Professor Lieberman, great remarks. Thank you. You mentioned that Israeli settlers are nervous, anxious because they face a Palestinian population where terrorism emanates, but they put themselves in that situation, and the Israeli government put themselves in that situation, and the Israeli army tries to protect them, but it can't be 100% sealed. And you know, to me, that's not Zionism. Zionism was a Jewish majority, and there's never going to be a Jewish majority in the West Bank. So, I think that the settlement enterprise has failed. What's your response?
I agree with you. As I say, it's short-sighted. It's hard to see a long-term solution with these settlements continuing. It would lead to an apartheid system. But I think the settlement project has two well springs. The original and more important motivation was a feeling that the Palestinians have attacked us from the east at least 3 times. We can't continue to allow this to happen. We have to defend ourselves, and the best way to do it, we can't ever allow a Palestinian state. We have to break it up by having settlements. So it's a strategic, rational, considered strategy. But alongside that, you have the messianic commitment to settle the whole land, and that's very strong within the right. And that doesn't have a rational component to it, really. It's rational in the sense if you make the assumption that you're following God's will, but if you don't make that assumption, it's hard to see what the logic is. So these two, and of course now the second motivation is becoming ever stronger. So, but I agree with you. It's a ill-conceived, in the same way as Palestinian constant resort to violence, unwillingness to accept peace agreements. You know, in 2000 when the Oslo process was almost finished, the Sultan Bandar ibn Sultan, who was the son of the Saudi emir, said to Arafat, he says, Mr. Arafat, we have a peace agreement on the table. Every time a peace agreement's on the table, we say no. Then later we say yes, but it's not on the table anymore. I'm telling you now, if you don't accept this peace agreement, it's not going to be a tragedy, it's going to be a crime. But of course, Arafat rejected it. That's been the pattern all along. It's happened 7 or 8 times. So that's the problem that Israel faces. And so they think the rational response to that problem is to break up Palestinian territory with settlement. It's hard to know how that's going to sustain it, where it's going to go. I mean, if anybody had asked my opinion, of course nobody's interested in my opinion. What I would have done is to keep certain strategic areas along the Green Line and around Jerusalem and say, we need these for strategic reasons for the time being. If you want to make peace with us, we'll give these back. Or we'll come up with some solution. But in the meantime, we're going to hold them in escrow until we have a rational partner to deal with. Of course, you're never going to get a rational partner, but it would take away the opprobrium from Israel, and it would diminish world criticism of Israel. Because Israel would say, we're the peaceful, rational actor in this situation. So, but it's too late for that.
I want to also comment on something that you said, which is, you said that's not Zionism, right? I think one of the interesting things is that it is Zionism to the settler movement, right? One of the complicated things about Israel is that it's got this multiple personality, and that's kind of part of its tension that exists there as well, right? We had Rabbi Ed Feinstein from Valley Beth Shalom come 6 years ago, and he gave a lot of really great talks, but one of the things that I really remember is there was a young man who stood up and said, I grew up being told that I need to be a supporter of Israel, and then I look at what Israel does sometimes, and it makes me really hard for me to be a supporter of Israel. And Ed Feinstein responded by saying, you're right to have that tension. It's hard because Israel tries to be a few different things sometimes. And one of those things is, for the settler movement, the dream of the greater Israel, right? Reclaiming the Jewish homeland in its entirety, in Judea and Samaria. Another part of the Zionist dream is being a refuge for Jews no matter what, period. And if that means being tough, and if that means doing whatever it means doing whatever it takes to make sure that Jews are safe, which comes in direct contrast to the third idea of Zionism, which is to be Or L'Goyim, which is to be a light unto the nations and to show the world what the Jews are capable of as far as peace and as far as building a society that is about peace and love and growing, right? And all three of those things are in direct contrast with one another. And they undermine one another, right? And that's part of the tension that we were looking at, right? So what is Zionism? Political Zionism, religious Zionism, biblical Zionism, and ethical Zionism. And sometimes they're in tension with one another. Often they're in tension with one another. Mrs. Shank, you got the last question, okay? Okay.
I'm not that knowledgeable about the composition of the West Bank population, but it sounds familiar. I mean, often ethnic minorities in the United States who are aspiring to have a firm cultural self-image and who are torn by the dangers of assimilation, they embrace with great fervor this original ethnic self-image. That's true, for example, in the United States, the Irish were the greatest supporters of the IRA. Irish Americans, they gave money and I don't know what else they gave. And in Canada, the Sikh population are the greatest supporters of Khalistan, which is an independent Sikh population, much more enthusiastic than the people in India itself, where the Sikhs are not particularly interested. So I think this pattern of strong Zionism, like Maher Kahane and the Jewish Defense League, that it fits that larger pattern of a kind of insecure population struggling against assimilation by embracing a fervent nationalist identity.
Sure.
Yeah. I have mixed feelings about it. I don't think it's going to make any difference because the University of Michigan has been trying for years to increase the black population. It's actually fallen. It's only about 4 or 5% now. It used to be about 8 or 9%. I don't think these policies make much difference, to be honest. Yeah.
For us. I think that's true. I think it's also we have also been Zionists for 2,000 years before the state of Israel. A lot of you who are congregants have heard me say this a million times, so here's 1,000,001. But what I've said over and over again is that the main protagonist, the main character in the Torah is the land of Israel. Right? Not Abraham, not Moshe, not these great figures. The person who shows up, the main character that shows up over and over again is Eretz Israel. There is a Zionism built into Judaism that is not necessarily political Zionism, but is a deep belief that there is something holy and sacred about a certain place. And even when we've been in Galut, and maybe perhaps Dafka because we've been in Galut, we've been in diaspora, we've been spread out throughout the world, it makes us find each other even more and cling to each other even more when we face east and bow towards a certain place, even if we have no desire to live there ourselves, right? So the foundation of the State of Israel is a powerful way of expressing that Zionism, and especially the Zionism of a refuge for the Jewish people, and also the expansion of a Jewish homeland and the reunification of a Jewish homeland. But I would argue that you don't actually need to have a political State of Israel to have a religious idea of Zionism and an idea that the land itself is sacred. Yeah, thank you all, and thank you again to Professor Lieberman for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
I have no idea when I'm going to be able to edit and get this out, but it'll be out eventually, and I will let you know via email, and we'll have it in audio format, and we'll have it in video format if you want to share it with, or watch it again, listen to it again, or share it with friends. We'd appreciate it. So thank you again. Wonderful day.